I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'm Mary Ann Ashton. I'm one of the co-presidents of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. Welcome. We're so glad you could join us for this webinar with Nancy Thomas to discuss effective ways to raise engagement among our younger voters. This week, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. And while our in-person celebration has been put on hold, our work is very definitely not taking a break during this pandemic. I know that many of us are concerned about what our current health crisis will mean for ensuring that all voters can participate safely in this fall's elections. For the many college students who often call Massachusetts home, the uncertainties surrounding whether they will be on campus or learning remotely and where they will vote are even more complicated than for the rest of us. I am so pleased to introduce someone who can help us understand the complexities of this topic more fully. Nancy Thomas of the Tisch College at Tufts University serves as the director of the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education. This institute serves as a leading venue for research, resources, and advocacy on college student political learning and engagement in democratic practice. Their work includes the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, which offers more than 1,000 colleges and universities an opportunity to learn their student registration and voting rates, and a closer examination of their campus climate for political learning and engagement. Before we hear from Nancy, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Patty Comfort, who will give you an overview of how we're going to conduct this webinar, and then we'll get started. Patty?
Great, thank you, Mary Ann, and thank you to Nancy Thomas for joining us today and all of you who are with us on Zoom. The way that we're gonna do the presentation today is that we have some preset questions I am gonna ask of Nancy and then she's gonna answer. So about midway between the pre-planned questions, we'll stop and take some questions from the audience. So I wanted to let folks know that I'll be monitoring the chat box. So the Q&A box is disabled so that I only have to look at one thing, which will be the chat box. So if you have questions as we go along, or even if you have some already now, please go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. The other thing I want to let people know is that we are recording this. So if you have friends or other folks that might be interested, the recording will be on our website after this session. And let's see, I think that's it. That's all the housekeeping details. So I want to just get started by talking with Nancy about having her tell us what the facts are around student voting broadly. So we'll start with that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I don't think it's any secret that I love the League of Women Voters and really appreciate what everybody on this call does. One thing I bet would surprise you is that we surveyed our campuses. As Patty said, or Mary Ann, I think, explained, we have over 1,000 campuses that we work with, and we surveyed them a couple of years ago and asked what organizations do you work with, and we gave them a long list, and the League of Women Voters came out as the top organization that colleges and universities work with. That might come as a surprise to some people, but it certainly wasn't to me, and I'm really honored to be here. So thank you so much. In terms of the data, one thing that might help is if we start with who are college students today, because they aren't exactly who people might think they are. So, for example, how many are there? Well, there are 18 million, and that can fluctuate. This year, I think there is a concern that that number will drop off, and yet it's a little too soon to tell. On the other hand, a few years ago, we were up to 20 million. So that's a pretty stunning voting block. As you all know, young people are growing in number. They are bigger than the boomers, as they like to tell me sometimes. And they are a powerful group. They also are increasingly active and involved in political issues. There is a lot of activism around things like the environment or gun violence or racial equity. They care deeply, deeply about matters of inequality. And it's important to know what young people and college students care about, because it's one of the ways that the league can really communicate well with students, is to know what they care about. So we have a database of about 10 million college students for every one of the past four federal elections, 2012, 14, 16, and 18. So we have more than half of the college students in the country in our database. They are all over the country. They are representative in terms of every kind of institution. Every state in the country is a pretty balanced database. We could use some more community colleges, but there are many, many of those, so it's a little hard to even out those numbers. And so that's a big group. But the other thing that's kind of interesting about college students is that they are not the bucolic. They aren't in these bucolic settings where they go and live in these ivy-covered dorms and sit at the feet of faculty members and longingly absorb everything the faculty member says. No, that's not what a college student is today. College students are more diverse, both in terms of race and income levels. They are predominantly women, which is something that not all schools are like that, but a lot of schools are. They are predominantly in state. And by that, I mean that 83% of college students attend college in the state where they go, where they live, where their permanent residence is. They are also all ages, although it is true that about 85% are traditional, 18 to 29 or 18 to 24-year-olds. And then they also commute. So about half of college students commute, which means that their permanent residence is their home. And residence, as you'll hear later, is very relevant to the college student experience. They are a very unique voting constituency because they're mobile. They move and they move again. And if they live on a campus like Tufts University, they might move from one dormitory to another. And that means moving from Somerville to Medford, which means they vote in two different districts. So the mobility of college students presents unique challenges. That said, I think the question is, well, do they vote? And historically, the answer has been no. I mean, I think they came out of the gate pretty fast in 1972 as solid voters, but it's just gone down from there. And 2014 was a particular low. In 2014, just to give you a shocking number, only 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. So that's little better than 1 in 10. They did better for the presidential election in 2012. The numbers for all college and university students, that's undergrad and graduate, about 43% turned out to vote in 2012. But then the numbers for undergraduates were way lower. They were in the sort of around 37%. And for first-time voters, it was really tricky, and their numbers were even lower. We started giving campuses their individual campus level data in 2014. And while not all campuses paid close attention to what we call an NSOLV report, the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, a lot did, and a lot more have, particularly since 2016. And as a result, we saw enormous increases in 2018. We didn't see enormous increases in 2016. In fact, voting rates were only about 3 percentage points higher than they had been. So in 2018, all of a sudden, the sleeping giant awoke, and college students turned out at a rate of 40%, which was more than double of the rate in the last midterm, 2014. And just to give you a comparison, the nationally Americans turned out to vote at higher rates in 2018, they went up about 13 percentage points from 37% voting to in 2014, which was a historic low, to 2018 and about 50%. And that was a 13 percentage point gain. For college students, it was a 21 percentage point gain. So the rate of increase on college students tells us that they are on the move and they're very interested in voting. I think had this pandemic not hit, I would have said to you all, don't even worry about 2020, start focusing on 2022. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Just want to give you one other data point, and that is that college students in general are registered to vote. So that's something I know that the league focuses on college student registration a lot. I think every organization like yours does, and I think student groups on campuses do as well. But unlike everyday Americans, college students may be registered to vote, but they do not vote at the rates of everyday Americans. So census data suggests that about 82% of all Americans turn out to vote if they are already registered, whereas with college students, that number is very low. It's only 55% in a midterm and probably about 10 to 12 percentage points higher in an election, but it's still not close to what happens out in public life. And what that means is that there are additional barriers to voting that students are having trouble overcoming, and that simply registering them to vote does not address that. It also may be a motivational problem, which we can talk about in a bit. So those are your facts.
Wonderful. And so Nancy, those are sort of the broad facts. And now how does the pandemic affect what is going to happen with student voting now?
Yeah. Well, it ain't pretty, but it's probably not pretty for all Americans, right? Okay, so I could probably spend hours on this, and I will try not to, but let's just take one simple finding from our research. You know, we've not only done quantitative research to identify voting rates of college students, but we've also studied why. You know, what is it about the college experience that might be uh, educating for voting? And the thing is that voting is a very social act for college students. It's people get together, they join clubs, they're on sports teams, and if there's a mobilization effort on a sports team, the team members vote. If there's a mobilization effort within an a cappella group, the members of the a cappella group vote. It's a social act for students. We often joke about students taking dates to vote. You know, it's just we want it to be social, and in an era of social distancing, that makes that deeply necessary component of social cohesion and connectivity much more difficult. And we've already seen tons and tons of studies showing how students feel about this election, this remote learning experience. And they're all saying they feel so isolated. They all feel so deprived of the social life that they relish, that they want better relationships with their peers and faculty, and that they are not having opportunities to do that. So that, I think, is one big problem. Then there are sort of the mechanical sides of voting that are going to be an enormous problem and might be of more interest to you all. So just as an example, how are they going to flash an ID? You know, how do you flash an ID if you're not in person? If we are doing mail-in ballots, are people going to have to copy their identification and get it notarized or attached to it an affidavit? Students don't have printers at home. They don't have paper at home. They could pull out their phones and do a little selfie and say, I am who I am, but that's not acceptable in too many states. So just whatever identification is needed both to register and to vote, I think is going to be a challenge. Another big challenge is going to be residency. So while I said that 83% of college students reside in the state where they attend school, they about more than half of them also live far from school. So they've got a permanent address back home where they grew up, and they've got a school address. And the idea was that under the Supreme Court's rulings about college students and their legal right to vote near or on campus, if that's where they are residing, we don't know where they're going to be residing yet. And that's a problem because a lot of students are already registered. And they are already registered either in their permanent address because somebody told them to, and now they're going to be back on campus in the fall, or they are residing on their campus address and yet they're going to be stuck at home. So there has to be some kind of relaxation or at least a uniform understanding of what it means to be a resident. And for a college student who enrolls in school, who has every expectation of being on campus in the fall, they're invested in that campus. Even first-year students who have never lived there are so excited to be there and to be part of a community, be part of a new experience, and to be thrown back into, sorry, you got to do it the old way, or now you have to rethink how you're doing this. It's going to be a tremendous challenge. And not only is it going to be hard to re-register students, it's going to be, there are going to be deadlines. I was visiting with, I listened in on a public commission yesterday in New Hampshire on college student voting. And they were talking about how the primary is the day after Labor Day. Well, some of the schools, the students aren't even back yet, but they will be back. And they have a right to vote in the primary, and yet they aren't physically there. And those are big problems. Another big problem that I think we can all anticipate is around the safety of poll workers and concern for those poll workers who are going to be seeing a lot of people. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. We saw the number of COVID cases that went up as a result of that election. There's even one death that is attributed to the fact that this person was a poll worker, and that's a scary thing. So there's going to be a decline in poll workers, and as a result, there are going to be longer lines and more congestion. So all of that is tricky. So then what do? You say, all right, well then everybody needs to vote absentee. Well, some states don't allow that unless there's an excuse. Is COVID an excuse if you don't have it? I don't think that's been worked out. Now, interestingly, New Hampshire seems to be ready to pass an administrative rule that says that everybody gets a disability status for this election because there is the potential for them to get very sick, or they might actually be sick, or they may be taking care of somebody who's sick. So they're treating it more like people who are voting, who are living abroad, expats, and that they're going to use the processes for expats and apply it to more voters, which I think could apply to college students. So this combination of sort of a pass based on an expectation of either the potential of a disability or illness, or the actual illness, plus these mechanisms that are already in place to accept ballots from people who are living out of the country, I think might help solve that problem. I'm going to stop there because I think there are a lot more I could talk about, but I just threw so much at you. I just kind of want to come up for a pause.
Okay. We have gotten a few questions about, I think maybe this is a good time to sort of ask you about a couple of particular programs that people have just asked about and get your thoughts on that. So one question is, are you familiar with the Ask Your College campaign, engaging alumni and student parents in influencing the college administration?
Yeah.
Um,
hmm I am familiar with it. I think it gets to one of my recommendations, which would be one for you all as well, and that is ask. I would probably use a tougher word. I would say lobby, cajole, plead, threaten, and arrange for all sorts of violence if they don't. Ask the presidents of the colleges in your area to use their positionality to influence the right of students to vote. College presidents have been too quiet. They have been too quiet, and they have not been strong on what it means to live in a democracy, what our responsibilities are for citizenship, and then absolutely ensuring that their students are not deprived of their rights as citizens. This is a job for a president or a senior cabinet. It is something that campuses could put a lot of attention to, rallying the political science department, bringing students in to talk to the legislature, all sorts of things. But presidents need to be out front and running about this. So I think the ask your, what is it? Your ask
yeah,
your,
Ask
yeah,
Your College
ask
campaign.
your college. So I
Yeah.
think that's along the same lines. What they're saying is, look, alumni give money, and they need to attach some strings to it. So if you're going to give money, make sure that the president knows I'm not giving you any money unless you make sure that our students are able to vote. It doesn't have to be that adversarial. Even in New Hampshire, which, they're trying to pass some pretty tough laws that are going to affect college students. The presidents were on this commission testifying, and everybody was completely receptive to what the presidents had to say. And I, I just, I think they come with a lot of goodwill and stature, and they ought to use it. So I'm familiar with that particular program, but I think it's not exclusive to alums. I
Okay.
think faculty could do this. I think students could do this, and I think you all can do this.
Right. So you'll be glad to know that someone in our audience, Kate Kavanaugh, just sent a link, which is a link that supports people to write to their college president. So that's a great action item. The other question that's related to this, Nancy, is someone wrote Motivote is a way to work with the issue of peer-to-peer motivation. Have you heard of it? And what are your thoughts about it? It's help friends, turn out friends kind of thing.
Yeah, I am not familiar with that one, but there are other things. There are things like, party at the polls, and yesterday on the New Hampshire call, it was sort of interesting because a whole bunch of people talked about food. Oh, you just have to feed them and they'll turn out. So all of that is probably true, and even our research suggests that if there's a lot of spirit on campus and it's viewed as there's kind of a buzz around voting and it's fun, that helps. I believe that. I really do. I just don't believe that voting should be the end goal. I think voting is a means to an end, and that end is a stronger, healthier democracy. And if we being higher ed, if we don't attach voting with education, that's a big mistake. And students vote because they learn. They learn not only the nuts and bolts of voting and what voting machines look like and how to fill out a ballot. That's a learning experience. But they also learn how a bill becomes a law, or they learn about, like, there are so many teachable moments in this epidemic. So many teachable moments, and they should all be taught. I mean, the most obvious one is whose job is it to stop the epidemic? Is it a federal role, or is it a state role, or is it a local role? Students need to be grappling with these questions. So while I'm all for the spirit and the fun and the take a date and have a party and get in the car together to go vote, I hope that it is more about what it's more core to the institutional mission, which is student learning.
Right. One other question in this sort of line of questioning, do you also recommend that professional schools like nursing schools be encouraged, be contacted to encourage their students to vote? Is that?
They're citizens. Yes, so absolutely. And in fact, I think that anybody in the STEM fields need a little extra help. Our voting rates are very, very high for some disciplines and relatively low for others. Nursing isn't that bad because it's mostly women, and women vote at higher rates than men. But the STEM fields more broadly are really problematic in terms of their voting rates. And I can't ask you all to guess. Oh, actually, I could. Write in the chat what you guess would be the highest voting rate discipline. So which discipline votes at the highest rate? I'll come back and tell you about that in a sec. But the STEM fields are really low and they need extra attention. And part of that is, I believe, and that this is what our research shows, it's partly due to the curriculum, and the curriculum being so packed that there is a perspective among faculty. We don't have time to talk about democracy, or we don't have time to talk about the public relevance of our field or the policy issues. And that's just wrong. I mean, not only do you have time, you have to make time. And it is the responsibility of higher education to be educating for a strong democracy. And there are no exempt fields of study around that, including technology or leisure studies or recreational studies or sports medicine. I could go on and on and on. So every discipline needs to be mobilizing people to not only vote, but to understand the context for it.
Great. So take one more question in this sort of vein. The question is, how can I contact and energize editors of college newspapers? And is that something that people should be focused on?
I think it's a great idea. To my knowledge, it's a pretty decentralized bunch. Now, I know that there is an association of college student newspaper editors, but I'm not sure how robust it is. I don't know how many, there are 4,000 plus colleges and universities in the country. I don't know how many of them are a part of that. I will look into the association and get you all a link. I think it's a very important niche. I think student governments are also good access points for students.
Okay, great. All right, Nancy.
How
so
many disciplines? What do we get for disciplines?
Yeah, so
broad.
People, several people said political science, several people said education. Looks like education, political science were the big ones. Law, history, teaching, I guess that's education, would be the same. Those, psychology.
Okay.
So that ran the, yeah, that's how many, that's what folks are saying.
Can't believe nobody said engineering. Okay, so the answer is it's almost a tie between education and library sciences. Political scientists are not the highest in the country, which may be a function of the fact that the field is very theoretical. It's not as applied as education is. And one of the things that educators are taught is, why are we here? We all know why we're here. If you're an educator, you know that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison all said we can't have a strong democracy unless it's an educated citizenry. Got to have a strong system of public education. So that is ingrained in the learning, I would say, for those fields. In my view, we can't have a strong democracy without science. We can't have a strong democracy without, and we've seen this, talk about learning, adequate medical care, health care for everybody. And we all know that these are critical to a healthy democracy. So just have to remind faculty, sorry, people, that's the gig. That's the job. It's also why they have academic freedom, so they can educate for democracy without the threat of political constraints on what they might say. So, in case anybody asks you, that's why you have academic freedom.
All right, so let's move on to one of the pre-planned questions that we had talked about, which is, we've been sort of talking about it already, but what needs to happen to ensure that students vote in the broad sense?
Yeah, well, all of the barriers need to be flipped, of course. And so some of the things we've already talked about, but to me, it's a no-brainer. Students should be able to use their IDs, their college IDs. And, the problem there is that their different states have, you all know this better than I do, but they all have different requirements on their IDs. Some require photographs, some require addresses, some require expiration dates, and not all schools can afford to produce those. And in fact, in some cases, they go to produce them and the state legislatures defund it. So, getting secretaries of state to say we will accept whatever official college ID is around, it would be just an amazing upgrade, I think. Same day registration and voting would be really helpful to college students. I love them dearly. They're all brilliant and fabulous, but they don't all get their act together on time. And, they wake up on election day and they say, oh, I got to go vote. Well, if they haven't registered, that's a real problem. So same day registration and voting would really help them. It may not help them, however, in an era of COVID, in which case what we really need is same day registration and voting and early voting. Long times to vote. Now, we're going to need this anyway. All Americans are going to need this because we've got to spread out physically. We cannot all be bombing a polling location on the same day in between set hours. So as a safety matter, we have to switch to early voting if it's not already being done, and I think it is. Obviously, mail-in voting is very popular and is a big recommendation going on right now. I don't think it solves the problems that students face, which is where do I get a copy of this, that, and the other thing, and where do I get a stamp, and how do I know how much the envelope is going to cost me to mail, and I can't go over to the post office and have it weighed, and so that is a little bit of a problem. To the extent that things can be done online, that's a very good idea. So for example, there's absolutely no reason why every citizen in this country cannot request a ballot for either mail-in or absentee electronically. They should not have to go somewhere to request that. It's just the ballot. So it is crazy to me that we don't have easy ways to simply make that request, which is going to happen if everybody's being the recommendation is broadly, you got to mail in your voting materials. Another thing is that we need longer lead times to register if we're not going to do same day registration and voting. And then polling locations. So this is something I've been talking a lot about, and that is we're going to have any in-person voting, and I think we have to have some in-person voting. College gymnasiums are really good locations for that because you can spread out those polling stations in big ways, and then poll workers feel, as I said before, pretty threatened. Well, college students can be trained to be poll workers. So train students to be poll workers, have them help process forms, stand there, be part of the electoral integrity issues, the solution to that, and spread it out. Now, I will say that there are some college campuses that are saying, well, we're going to bring back our students, but we're going to go into lockdown. In other words, we're going to bring them back, but we're going to minimize the amount of people who are on our campus. So that may be a barrier to saying to a president, you got to let the town in to vote in your gym. So just be aware that there are concerns about that. And then the other thing that I have been hearing a lot about from town clerks is we aren't going to be able to handle the volume of mail-in ballots. And once again, that's a great way to involve students if we can figure out a way to do it that preserves the integrity of the system. We don't want to get into a situation where somebody says, oh, there was voter fraud. Oh, look at how many college students were working the polls or something like that. So they need training. They need to be maybe carefully selected, that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the things you just talked about are actually the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, at least in Massachusetts right now, we're working on a bill that's in the legislature right now, which hit almost every single point you just mentioned. So same-day registration was the bill we were working on up until COVID hit. And now we've had to sort of pivot and talk about longer early voting periods, longer voter registration periods, mailing everyone a ballot for the November election, and having COVID-19 be rendered a disability, even the fear of it, to be able to receive an absentee ballot. So I feel like the legislation that we're working on is not, as you mentioned, is not only going to help students, but everybody in our state. So we'll see what happens. There's supposed to be some action on that next week.
I think that's great. Just a couple of nuancy little points.
Mm-hmm.
What college students really need is portability of their identification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if state says we will only accept an identification form that is produced in this state,
right?
So I think we have to decouple identity and residency, and states need to accept any form of government issued identification to prove identity, and then they need to come up with something else for residency. So, and with students, it's particularly problematic. First of all, as I said earlier, they aren't sure where to register right now. And so we need to have systems that are nimble where they can re-register. Okay, I registered at home, but look, my campus is opening, or vice versa. So portability of the identification forms that are used to say I am who I am is one thing. And then the other thing that I think is a really good idea, and if any of you know who's working on this or doing this, let me know. I know of one, and I'm trying to grapple with technology to see if I can get it out to everybody. But it seems to me that if a campus presents to the Secretary of State's office or the local officials a list of students who are enrolled, end of discussion, they are residents, right? So there is a better way if we can have portable identification and something coming from the university to prove residency, we will remove a lot of barriers for college students. So decouple those two things, aim for portability. So run back and amend your law.
So I think maybe we'll take a few questions now, and then we'll get on to our last sort of pre-planned question that we had talked about. So the one question was, what role do you see for social media in what's happening now with in terms of getting information out to people?
Yeah, well, we know from research that emails don't work.
Okay.
So the question is there another way? Social media tends to be a real mixed bag, and there's a lot of misinformation, fake news, nefarious emails in 2016 that were aimed at historically Black colleges and universities, painting Hillary Clinton as a racist and taking the words in her mouth and switching them. You know, this social media is a really tricky area right now, and yet it is the way students communicate, period. It's the way they do it. They, you know, they use their thumbs. So I don't think there's a perfect solution here. Other than you need to, well, to mobilize college students, you need to sort of form a pyramid on a college campus so that, you know, maybe there's a coalition, and then they go to deans, and then the deans go to department chairs, and the department chairs go to faculty, and the faculty go to students. And maybe they can set up social media in such a way that that could happen that way. And then the social media is coming from a trustworthy and trusted source. And I think faculty are going to be the absolute key this year to communicating with students. They are the only consistent and reliable way to reach all students. Doesn't mean that the newspaper or the student government or student organizations are not going to matter. They definitely do, going back to this issue of it being a social act, but there are a lot of students who don't participate in those things. They can't. They have 2 jobs and 3 kids, and you know, it goes back to this bit about, well, who are college students these days? And they're not hanging out in dorms and spending their weekends at a fraternity.
So these two questions are, I'm just going to ask them both because it's sort of two different vehicles on campus, if you will. So what experience do you have working with honor societies, and how helpful are alumni associations?
Yeah. So I have no experience working with honor societies, but I will tell you that honor societies will then reach honor students. And that may be the group you need to reach, and it might not be. Remember, every campus that participates in our study gets all these breakdowns. They get their voting rates, but it's also broken down by age and class level and field of study. We don't have data on clubs. So, and we don't have data on honors societies. So I can't tell you whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We did visit one campus to do some research, and they had a very interesting, they had a first year experience where all the students learned to talk about political issues. They learned to frame them, debate them, present them, discuss them, you know, find common solutions. It was part of the common experience for all students but the honor students. And they were somehow passed out of that program. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense to me. So focusing on honor students, I would say, is exactly the same as focusing on all other groups of students. Great way to do it. Get the whole group. Just don't make it the only group you focus on.
Mm-hmm. And alumni associations, is it helpful to work? Are they helpful?
I think that alumni associations in general try to be very, very helpful for colleges and universities, particularly in doing things like raising money or trying to raise awareness about some of the cool things that campuses are doing. I have not seen many, I can't say none, I haven't seen many that are focusing on voting. And I think this Ask Your group is focusing on alums and asking alums to ask the president. So look, all hands on deck. They're all good. They're all valuable, including alumni associations.
And
Just remember, sometimes they tend to be, a certain group. Alumni associations are full of people who loved their college. Not everybody loved their college, and so it may not reach everybody. Want to find ways to reach everybody, and particularly those students who feel left behind, isolated, unwelcome, where their sense of well-being is really being thrown off.
Yeah. And the last one in this vein, Nancy, that I'll ask is, the question is, what role is the American Association of University Professors playing in either registering students to vote or getting them to actually vote?
Good question. I have no idea.
Okay.
I have been trying to figure out how to reach faculty, and the AAUP is steadfastly apolitical. And sometimes, and I don't know this about the AAUP, but for other people, sometimes they mistakenly use the terms partisan and political interchangeably, and they are not interchangeable terms. And it is not good and probably illegal for a faculty member or anybody on campus to tell students which party to support and which candidate to support. But they have to talk about political issues. And it doesn't matter if a political issue then gets divided by one party or another. That is not partisan. That's political. And so somehow we got to get the message out that it is perfectly appropriate, if not mandatory, for faculty members to talk about policy matters or big ethical questions facing society, or even issues that are on the ballot in certain ways, But it is not permissible for them to then go the next step and say, and as a result, you need to vote for so-and-so.
Right, right. Okay, so the final question that you and I had talked about was, we'd like to know what your suggestions are for what the League of Women Voters can do here in Massachusetts. And we hear loud and clear the affordability issue. So, I mean, I think that is something that we will definitely take away. And I also heard you say loud and clear to be, to the extent possible, be in touch with college presidents in our areas. And since we have 46 local leagues in Massachusetts and a lot of college towns, I think that is actually something that is a good sort of takeaway or to do for our local leagues. But what other suggestions do you have for what the League of Women Voters can do? And anybody in the audience, if you want to put in the chat some ideas you have, or maybe you're already doing some things, I'd be glad to field those and talk with Nancy about those.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're already doing a lot, because you're not only trying to change laws and administrative rules to make voting easier and more accessible in this pandemic era. And so I applaud you for that and want you to continue that. I also know that you often litigate, and I think that's terrific too. Keep on top of these things. It is really hard these days to stay on top of this stuff, and I'm very worried about these sneaky last minute things. I was talking with somebody at Election Protection on Friday last week, and they were saying that South Carolina closed something like 100 polling places the day before the primary. Gee, I'd like to know where. That's just nuts. I mean, that risks, and yet they probably didn't have enough poll workers. So one of the things I think the league could help work with is local officials and saying to them, you know, we don't want you to be overwhelmed. We don't want you to get into a situation where you don't feel safe. How can we help? And would more people power help? Because this college or this university is really able to provide some support. Would you help us work with them, or could we all work together to remove these barriers of voting and at the same time provide you with the support that you need? I'm sure they're all freaking out over the numbers of ballots they're going to get, and the prospect of having to be in person when it's not safe. And nobody want I don't think local officials want to deprive anyone of their rights. I think they just are often overwhelmed, and so helping that would be a good idea. I think you all do a lot of voter education, and that's very valuable to college campuses. All 4,000 campuses are not going to be able to reconstruct voter education. It's really important that that these rules around voting are demystified. One of the things that really ruins the experience for college students is simply the mechanics. So I was giving a talk and I Googled voting machines and looked for images, and I came up with 28 images and not one was my machine. That's just nuts. Somebody needs to produce a video that says, here is a machine in Massachusetts. This is what you will see, you know, or here's a ballot. This is what it looks like. Students can produce these videos and they love that kind of project. So there's no reason why it couldn't be a collaborative thing. But then getting it out to everybody is a role that the league could really play. I think that you could, in addition to being, I think I'm really describing the role as advocacy, resource, educator, and communicator, you know, and probably a pretty healthy mediator. The league is just so respected by everybody that it has a unique position as negotiator, if you will, you know, the ones that can bring people together and say, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? I think that's an ideal role for you all.
Right. I know that we have a question about specifically engaging community college administrations, you know, and getting in the civic engagement conversation. And I know you've talked, if you want to, I'd like for you to just re-highlight the stat about community colleges and then give us your thoughts about, because obviously we have several in Massachusetts and local leagues in those areas. So if you could talk to that for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, because community colleges are not residential, they don't get the benefits of the residency requirements that the Supreme Court gave other institutions that have residential housing for students. So then they're as decentralized as everyday voters, but they do come to campus. And they do, this is a great example of who's the most consistent person in their life from campus, a faculty member. So I think, you know, community colleges actually have the voting rates across institutional type are very, very close. It's a very small gap. But community colleges tend to do better in midterm elections than residential colleges, and then residential colleges do better in presidential elections. And I just think that makes sense because the commuters are more vested in the local community, and so the elections that are often more localized, they're not the big splashy presidential elections, are the ones that they care about a lot. But again, this goes back to voter education and some of the things that you all can do to make sure that voters are informed, that the process is demystified, and that they get the support that they need to be able to vote. And it applies the same for community college as it does for everybody else. One other thing I meant to mention is we've got to solve the paperwork problem for mail-in voting. Okay, now I suggested a way to do that, which is college IDs and online, some kind of online system where the campuses provide the list and the local officials know then that they are residents, and portable IDs. But if for some reason that doesn't pass in a lot of states, what are we going to do about documentation and what needs to be provided? It's just, for not voting in person, I can't just reach into my hip pocket and pull out my driver's license and flash it. Nobody's going to have a printer. Nobody's going to have a stamp. And on college campuses, they really don't have printers and stamps. So, and there was one other thing I meant to mention. These campuses, some of them are super divided. Tufts is divided right down the middle. So if I'm living in Somerville, a dorm in Somerville one year, and then the next year I move across campus, I got to re-register in Medford. Now, I think this is something that can be tackled when we do our redistricting, but boy, can we stop gerrymandering campuses? In some places it's done on purpose to dilute the college student vote, but in some places it probably just happened that way. I don't think that college student vote should be diluted, and when it is, it makes it a lot harder for students to stay registered and to vote.
Yeah, so just one clarification that I just got about the community college question. The viewer would like more clarification on community colleges not being residential in relation to voting. What did you mean when you were talking?
They're commuter schools. Very few community colleges have dorms. Some do, and then they've got a residential community. And if the students all live near the campus, it still isn't quite the same if it's a commuter school. So they're probably going to have to vote where they reside, which is not in a dormitory. Now at Tufts, half of the students live in dormitories and the other half live in apartments around campus. And yet but then they have an address and they are residents and they have a right to vote there. If I'm a Tufts student and I'm living out in Arlington, I probably should be voting in Arlington. But if I have as opposed to, let's say I'm a California resident traditionally, and I moved to Tufts, but now I took an apartment out in Arlington, you got to vote in Arlington. You don't vote in Medford or Somerville.
Great, thank you. Well, I have enjoyed this back and forth with you tremendously. I'm going to turn it over now. We're at the top of the hour. I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann Ashton to just thank you and give a closing.
Thank you, Nancy, for being with us today and giving us so much food for thought about our work and engagement among college students. Thank you to each of our audience members for being part of this webinar today. Thank you to Patty for facilitating, and to Taylor Gringa and Bryn Gorman for their work to make this webinar happen. The work begun by our organization 100 years ago to advocate and educate around voting for everyone continues in our organization today. In these uncertain times, we are committed more than ever to ensuring that every voter can vote and vote safely. All levels of the League of Women Voter are working now to pass legislation and encourage our leaders to plan for a challenging election cycle in the months to come, here in Massachusetts and throughout the United States. Each of you are a part of our efforts by being a member of the League, by advocating for voting rights, and by supporting our organization with your philanthropy. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks.
And thanks for the resources in the chat. Keep them coming.
Great.